everyone, welcome back to Policy Punchline. Here at the show, we interview scholars, policymakers, business executives, and public intellectuals about some of the most important issues and frontier ideas in our world today. I'm Princeton senior Tiger Gao. Today here with me is Rob Henderson. He is a PhD candidate in social psychology at Cambridge University. He is a Gates Cambridge scholar. So you may have heard the Rhodes Scholarship. So the Gates Cambridge Scholarship is kind of the equivalent in Cambridge. A very prestigious honor and a very bright guy who writes a lot of newsletters and writes a lot of articles about human nature and social psychology on his Twitter. We look forward to having this fascinating conversation with him. So thanks so much for joining me today, Rob.
Yeah, hey Tiger, thanks for having me.
And co-hosting this show with me is my longtime friend Jansen Chu. He is a rising sophomore at Yale University, currently taking a gap year, joining us from Hong Kong. Thanks so much for joining me, Jansen.
Yeah, thanks for having me too, Tiger.
Rob, why don't we jump right in? You have a fascinating background, to say the least. I won't even go into it. Maybe I will just let you start. I usually give our guest a quick intro, but I think you will do the justice much better.
Yeah. I mean, so sort of a long story, but to give you the short version. So like you said, right now I'm currently in my third year, PhD candidate at Cambridge. Before this, I was at Yale for my undergrad and graduated in 2018. But before that, I had a very different kind of life. So to just back way up, sort of at the beginning, and I was born in Los Angeles. My mother, she was an immigrant from South Korea. She got into drugs. She just wasn't able to take care of me. So when I was 3, I entered foster homes in LA and just sort of moved around. I used to think that I lived in 4 different foster homes, but recently I looked at some old documents that my adoptive mother gave me from some social workers, and it turned out I lived in 7. So I moved so often that I don't even remember, like, just how many families I'd been with. Later on, I was adopted by this sort of working class family in a small town called Red Bluff in Northern California, which, I mean, it really doesn't look like, when people think of California, it looks nothing like LA or San Francisco or any of the big, like, sort of hub cities. It was a very small town of about 14,000 people, sort of blue collar. The median income when I had arrived there, median household income was about $27,000 a year. The big sort of the main places where people worked, places like Walmart, the local mill, lumber yard. People who went to college, worked at the high school, or taught or worked for the county. So it was, just sort of a more blue collar environment compared to the more sort of, like, I don't know, urban environment I come from in LA. I'd also experienced just a bunch of sort of drama and chaos in my childhood in this small town. My adoptive parents divorced shortly after I'd moved in with them. My adoptive father subsequently sort of cut off ties with the rest of the family because he was so angry about the divorce, stopped talking to me. Then my mother, a little bit later, fell in love with a woman who helped to raise me and my adoptive sister sort of into adolescence. But then she was shot when I was 14, when I was about to enter high school. So even though, like, I was always sort of a curious kid and enjoyed reading, and I maybe had some underlying potential, but just all of, like, basically my environment was like very, like, working hard to stop that from presenting itself, I guess, is one way of thinking about it. Just a lot of drama and chaos and turbulence. And so, right before high school, that family tragedy had occurred. And so basically I, for that and many other reasons, I just wasn't able to focus. Got really bad grades, graduated from high school with a 2.2 GPA in, like, the bottom third of my class. Joined the military when I was 17, and just sort of traveled around, learned a lot, matured. And there might be other reasons too, but basically, like, from there I was able to sort of stabilize a little bit and applied to Yale, and somehow managed to get in. And from there, my life has been sort of much more, I don't know, comfortable / boring, something like that. But that's sort of the short version. I'm happy to jump into any of those and explore further. But yeah.
Perhaps maybe we can dive into your experience at Yale. Very interesting because, as you mentioned, you grew up in foster homes, served in the military, ultimately ended up at Yale. This experience kind of reminded me of J.D. Vance, the author of Hillbilly Elegy, and he's been pretty big. He released a book a couple years ago, and now Netflix just released this movie, and there's a bunch of media discourse very recently about how good that movie is and such and so on. But he went to Yale Law School after going to having a very difficult background, and then he joined the military, which disciplined him, and eventually he did really well in life. And he called it Yale the Hollywood for nerds. And you described in an article in New York Post that Yale has been described as a Disneyland for brainiacs. Yeah. And you both come from very humble beginnings, but were transformed by the military service. So I would love to hear, I guess, in one way, part of the question is your similarity or differences with JD's past in that sense, but also how did Yale shape many of your thoughts when it comes to your current research and a lot of your opinions on social issues at large?
Yeah. I mean, so of course, I read JD's book, watched the movie fairly recently. Yeah, I mean, there are some similarities between our backgrounds and maybe some overlap between our views. One thing that his book stresses that I to some degree stress as well is the importance of personal responsibility, the importance of trying to do the right thing for your kids. The sort of basic family and responsibility. Those are things that I think are really important. And I think to some degree maybe we had the same experience in terms of like both of us being maybe kind of curious kids, but our family environments were just so unstable that it was hard to concentrate and hard to sort of get on that track towards the traditional path to college right out of high school. But yeah, for me, I had basically like no contact or familiarity with the kinds of people who go to places like Yale, who graduate from places like, and where they end up next in terms of the common career paths in whatever, finance, consulting, media, NGOs, like basically anywhere, right? And so I was fortunate because so toward the end of my enlistment in the military, I found this program called the Warrior Scholar Project, which I've written about in a couple of different pieces. One in that New York Post piece you mentioned, and I just wrote a piece that came out like a couple months ago in the New York Times about sort of TV and pop culture and the relationship between those things and social class. The Warrior Scholar Project is basically an academic program to help veterans get into college. It was actually started by a couple of students at Yale, I think in 2011 or something. But anyway, basically, if you're a veteran or someone in the military and you want to go to college, you apply for this, and it's like a 2-week boot camp where they teach you about college. They teach you like, how to apply for college, how to be a good student, how to write an essay, all those kinds of things, like sort of a crash course for people who've sort of been out of school for a few years, like I was. While I was there, all of those things were important. Sort of the academic stuff, learning how to do all of that. I had been such a poor student that this was like a really good experience for me from that perspective. But from another perspective, there was this sort of social class angle that I had, I started to understand it. I started to sort of glean the importance of non-academic factors in integrating into a place like Yale. So, I would talk to some of the tutors at this program, and many of them were Yale students or students from Dartmouth, or like basically other sort of undergrad students at various selective universities and institutions. And I would just sort of see what they did. I'd like talk to them and hang out and they'd say like, they watch shows like The West Wing. I learned how important this show was to a lot of young college students. They were constantly like reading the news, reading the New York Times, reading the Atlantic. Some of the writing instructors of this program would assign us articles from the New Yorker. And so I started to sort of catch on that like, oh, these are the sorts of things that educated people care about. These are the things that they consume. in terms of news, in terms of media, TV, and so on. And so I just started to give myself this sort of like, I took what I learned there, and over the next few months while I was in the military, while I was applying to college, I started to read more, sort of consuming all of these different publications, subscribing, whatever. And I still didn't quite get like the importance of them really. I just thought that like, oh, they read it, I should read it too. But yeah, it wasn't really until I got to Yale that I truly understood that like, you know, this is what they do. This is important to them. If you want to like share ideas, these are the places that you have to go. It's just so different, man. Like I can't remember a single time, for example, that like anyone that I grew up with, parents of friends or whatever, subscribing to the Washington Post or something like that. It's just the way people get news, and of course some of this may be because of time. 15 years ago it might have been different, but I don't think it was that different. Something else that I noticed was, and this sort of gets to my idea of luxury beliefs, which we can get into later, was just like how different people thought about things like responsibility. To bring it back to the earlier point, I've noticed that high achieving students often sort of downplay the importance of hard work, or downplay the importance of personal agency, even though they themselves tend to work very hard. Some of these, they'll take an Adderall and work all night, and then the next day they'll say like, oh, but it's systemic, or it's social forces that are at work here, and that's the reason why people can't get ahead. Meanwhile, I'll talk to my friends from the military or friends that I grew up with, and even though their lives are not maybe as whatever comfortable or ensconced in affluence, they actually do believe in things like responsibility and agency, and sort of believing that you can work hard and get ahead. So I find this contrast very interesting, that on the one hand, these people, maybe their lives aren't as great, but they still believe in hard work. And then these other people whose lives are pretty good, but then when you ask them about hard work, they say like, well, it's actually just systemic, or people have, it's out of our control. That contrast to me was really interesting.
Yeah, Rob. In the same New York article, like Tiger mentioned earlier, you talked about you're really into social psychology. And I guess, can you share more about your research you're doing at Cambridge and talk more about luxury beliefs?
Yeah. So my research at Cambridge, it's sort of loosely connected to the sort of public writing that I do. I'm mostly interested in moral psychology. Um, the kind of work that maybe you guys have read about from like Jonathan Haidt or something, about moral foundations, differences in moral intuitions between liberals and conservatives, or between different people based on their education. And so that's sort of my research area, Cambridge moral psychology. My luxury beliefs idea is related to that. The way that I came up with that was sort of a way for me to like untangle all of the observations that I had and all of the research that I had done on class, on status, on political beliefs. And so basically, I guess the first, like right away, I noticed that like the beliefs, the sort of moral and political beliefs at Yale were different than where I had come from before. In Red Bluff and in the military, it was just different, and I wondered like what could be responsible for this. Then I started to read more about how class was expressed historically. So it used to be expressed through material goods. This is sort of easy to understand, that like in the past, people would sort of like wear a tuxedo or go golfing, or display sort of jewelry, or wear a powdered wig. They would do all of these things to sort of distinguish themselves from the masses, from the commoners. The aristocrats would sort of show like, we are sort of above the rest of you, and here's how you know. Today we have more of, I think, an egalitarian streak. We don't like to display goods in that way. We think it's kind of vulgar to like, I mean, there are some subcultures where I guess this is more acceptable, but generally speaking, especially a place like Yale, it's sort of, I think, crass to like, I don't know, wear a bunch of like fancy clothes and like publicly display these kinds of things. The other thing is that material goods have become more affordable. So, even like my poorest friends from high school and Red Bluff, they still have iPhones. Maybe they have an older model or whatever, but like they still have the same kinds of material goods. It's harder to just sort of walk through a city and pick out who's middle class and who's rich, because we all kind of dress the same now. So people still care about status, though. Status doesn't go away. How do people who go to elite institutions who care about status display these things? How do we know that they care about status? Well, there's some research showing that if you sort of group people, categorize people by education, by income, by sort of subjective social class, or sort of how they would categorize themselves in terms of their own class. So they're the objective markers of income and education, then also they themselves, like where would they put themselves on the class ladder? Those things correlate with how much people care about status, how much they care about their reputation. So you just basically ask them, how much do you care about how you're viewed in terms of how much do you care about how others view you? The higher your social class, the more you care about status. So I found this interesting too as I was reading this. I thought to myself, like, okay, so these are the people that care the most about status. How are they attempting to manifest this? How do they display this? And then that's where I arrived at the luxury beliefs. There's an analogy to fashion here, where like fashion is constantly changing because the most fashionable people always want to be sort of on the leading edge of the industry. As soon as a particular look is adopted by the rest of society, they have to update and quickly change their wardrobe to show that, like, oh, I'm one of the fashionable people. I think something similar is going on among the affluent, the highly educated, well-to-do in the U.S., maybe other countries too, where, yeah, as soon as a particular belief, a sort of moral fashion, becomes widespread throughout society, they quickly become concerned and think like, oh wow, everyone has this belief, I better update it, I better change it. And I'm happy to go into particular examples of this. But basically my claim is that once a view becomes conventional and widespread, the educated class feels this pressure to distinguish themselves and update their moral fashions through luxury beliefs.
Rob, I guess one follow-up question would be, who creates these luxury beliefs? Do they spontaneously come from the rich? Do they come from the intellectuals? Do they come from college kids like us, Chanson and me, by us, who have too much time on our free hands? So who's dominating the social discourse these days, I guess?
Well, I mean, so basically all of the above to some degree, what you're saying. People who wield disproportionate cultural influence, social influence. So like I said, I mentioned all of those media outlets, some of those places that, years later now I've written for them. But, 5-6 years ago, I started to sort of consume this content. Those are the places, right, where sort of the leading edge cultural elites, people who attend places like Princeton and Yale or Harvard or whatever, they are the people who sort of broadcast and sort of determine what conversation topics get talked about. And I don't necessarily think it's like I want to be clear, I don't think it's like a calculated thing. I don't think that like people are sitting around thinking like, oh, well, the masses believe this, so now let's try to believe this. I think it's sort of this sort of implicit, maybe to some degree unconscious thing that's going on where, someone might, pen an op-ed somewhere, and it's a unique, in the moment it might be a unique or strange or shocking idea, but it sort of catches on. It feels trendy, like it sort of like goes viral or whatever. People start sharing it with each other. Other people start writing op-eds in response, and then the idea just sort of bubbles up to the surface, and then it becomes convention. Now you have to believe it, or otherwise you'll be shunned. So yeah, I think that it's basically the sort of all the above, the people who are in that sort of highly educated group, people who attend prestigious universities, who have access to media organs. And it's not just I guess the origin of it would be sort of content creators, writers, producers, whatever. but it becomes sort of repeated and amplified, and the message spreads through, sort of what movies you watch, the TV shows, podcasts. I'm sure people have listened to this podcast and learned some interesting ideas and shared them with others, right? And so it just sort of like it starts from a few individuals, and then over time it sort of rises to the surface in the sort of consciousness of the elite class.
So Rob, I'm about to say a lot of words, so please cut me off at some point if you think I'm not making sense. But what reminds me of is the recent rise of what some people call the intellectual dark web, led by Joe Rogan, Eric Weinstein, who famously devised this term called the institutional narrative, the gated institutional narrative. And in yesterday, I interviewed Robert Barnes, who is the lawyer of Alex Jones. We had a 2.5-hour conversation, and he also went to Yale from a humble background from the South, and he didn't like Yale and actually dropped out in protest for all kinds of reasons. Really interesting. But he explained what institutional narrative is going on and why there's idea suppression. And he says it's not Soros and Bill Clinton and Bill Gates get behind a room and they decide we need to suppress certain ideas and then make certain ideas better. It's that somehow the dominant forces in media and business today and culture are run by people who have all received relatively the same educational background, and they all have relatively the same beliefs. And by run by the people, he doesn't mean a group of white men getting behind the closed doors. It's literally just if you are an editor at New York Times, if you're a journalist at The Atlantic, if you happen to be a software engineer in Silicon Valley at Facebook, but because you guys all commonly look at the same issues through the same lens, and you arrive at the same conclusion. So you ban Alex Jones at the same time in his case, and he's really against that, and you all push for certain narratives at the same time. So is that something that you are kind of talking about, which is that it's not something conscious, but it just happens because of the way culture has been going?
Yeah. I mean, I think maybe what he's getting at is this sort of, I mean, it's spontaneous. It's not top down. It's bottom up. I mean, maybe another way to think about this, I guess, like to shift it to something more maybe neutral or less morally charged, would be something like career tracks, right? So when you first get to, I mean, I witnessed this. Maybe you've seen something similar at Princeton, where like when people first get to an elite university, they're like, oh, I want to go to med school, I want to change the world, I want to, do all these, start a company or something. And then once you get there, it's like, what is it, like 30 or 40% of the graduating class each year goes to consulting, finance, and tech, or something like that, right? And so when you first get there, you have your own path in mind of what you want to do, and then you're just sort of marinated in this culture of like, everything is like there's like subtle pressure everywhere you turn to go onto one of these three tracks. Everywhere you go, like all the recruiting events, the career things, whatever, like all the dinners, like everyone around you, everyone starts thinking like, well, everyone else is doing, maybe I should. And everyone sort of starts drifting towards those three. And then that's why, at the beginning, it's like, I don't know, 10% of students say they want to work. And then at the end, it's 40% end up actually going there. And so I think something similar is going on with maybe more moral beliefs, with political beliefs, where, maybe the students sort of arrive and have more of an open mind, but there's all this subtle pressure around, and you start to learn which opinions receive the finger snaps, receive the validation, the accolades, the Instagram likes, and which opinions are sort of like, you get sort of more of a condemnatory response, more disapproval, whatever. And so, we're human beings. We like to, get validation and esteem and respect from the people around us. And over time, we just sort of respond to the rewards and punishments of our environment. And then we slowly start to get onto this track of like, oh, well, I guess these are the things I'm supposed to believe. I think there's a little bit of what the economist Timur Kuran, he's an economist at Duke, he calls it preference falsification, which, yeah, maybe you guys have encountered before. But I mean, the basic idea is that people will publicly express opinions and beliefs that they don't necessarily agree with 100%, but because there's either sort of, state sanctioned punishment for it, or just like local social punishment in your environment for expressing them. People will just say things that they don't necessarily believe. Whereas privately, maybe they'll have more concerns, more reservations about it. I mean, there's a related idea from the management expert Jerry B. Harvey. He's talked about the Abilene Paradox. And the Abilene Paradox, I guess, is sort of similar to preference falsification, but the idea is basically that, like, imagine that there are three people and they're all trying to decide where to go for dinner, and one of them says, let's go to this restaurant in Abilene, which is, in a distant town, long drive away. So one person suggests, and they don't even really want to, but they're just throwing out a suggestion. A second person doesn't really want to argue. They don't really want to go there, but they don't want to argue. So they say, like, yeah, that sounds fine. Let's go to Abilene. Now the third person is watching this and they're thinking, like, well, these two people want to go to Abilene and I don't want to, like, be the odd person out. I don't want to be the, the dissenter here. I guess if these two guys want to go, then I'll go too. And now you have three people who are going to a place that none of them actually want to go. And I think there's something going on as well with, maybe some of the cancel culture stuff, some of the luxury beliefs ideas that I've expressed. I noticed, for example, we were talking earlier about what happened at Yale with the student protests with the Christakises and how they were trying to get Erica Christakis fired for her email. I noticed publicly, people were very sort of vocal about how upset they were at her and how she should step down from her position as the, then the associate master of the residential college, how she should be fired from her faculty position, and so on and so forth. But I would notice privately, many, many more people would say things like, it really isn't right how the way people are treating her. It's not fair. Like, I feel bad for her. But people were scared to say it publicly because they didn't want to draw negative attention to themselves. Something similar happened with me. So this was last year, actually. So Jordan Peterson, who's sort of a controversial figure, I guess, psychologist, he was supposed to visit Cambridge to be like a research fellow or something, like visiting faculty, whatever. And, a bunch of student activists, and I think faculty too, a bunch of people just protested and got him disinvited. And it seemed like that was the dominant opinion, right? Like, it seemed like most people didn't want Jordan Peterson on campus. I wrote an op-ed in the New York Times defending Jordan Peterson, saying whatever, like basically saying, like, we should protect free speech. Okay, maybe he's controversial, but he has some interesting ideas. He clearly has interesting ideas because his book sold like 5 or 6 million copies, so people are listening to him. And so publicly everyone's all upset at him, but then privately I write this op-ed, and then I'm getting all of these emails at me, all these messages, Twitter DMs, like, oh, that was such a great op-ed. People here at Cambridge, professors too, students and professors at Cambridge, saying, like, oh, that was such a great op-ed. I really think that Jordan Peterson is an interesting guy, et cetera, et cetera. But none of them wanted to say anything publicly. So you have this situation where this 10% of the population is publicly very vocal and instilling fear in the rest of us. And the other 90%, I would say really it's sort of like maybe, whatever. Basically like another 30 or 40% who don't like it, but they're quiet. And then the rest are kind of in the middle. But the vast majority of people are not, trying to silence others. They're just scared. And so I've seen this. I saw it at Yale. Now I've seen it here at Cambridge. And I think, again, I think this goes back to, highly educated, affluent people care a lot about what their peers think about them. They care more than other people relative to less educated, less affluent people. People like us say we care more about what our friends think of us than the average person. And so we are very concerned with saying the wrong thing.
Yeah, I guess can go back to the previous point about finance. I read a very interesting book recently by Rene Girard. It's about he talks about mimetic theories, basically that desires are mimetic. So like, for example, like me, you, Tiger, like Tiger likes finance, and like we hang around each other, and slowly his interests start to become mine. So I guess I kind of see that a lot in finance. Like people don't really start, they don't really don't even know what investment bank is when they get into Yale, but then they hang around with the crowd along, and then they slowly change their desires. But can we go back to the Christakis instance? Because I don't think Tiger or most people outside of Yale? I don't think a lot of people know what's going on here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just the very short version of it is the Yale admin. So this was the fall of 2015. This was like literally 8 weeks or something into my first semester. I had just got out of the military, and then like 4 days later, I start my first day at Yale. And then 8 weeks after that, the Yale administration releases an email saying, like, basically, be careful with what you wear. Don't, wear culturally appropriative costumes or something. Um, basically saying like, just whatever, don't wear this or you should wear that or something. And then Erica Christakis, who was the associate master and I think she's like a lecturer, she's on the faculty at Yale, wrote an email to students basically calling that administrative email into question, saying like, do we really need the administration sort of policing our lives and telling us what to wear and so on, and basically defending freedom of expression and saying like, if you have a problem with someone's costume, maybe the best way to handle it, since we're all adults, is to just talk to each other. And that email ignited just this very sort of vocal response, vicious reaction. There were protests all around campus. I saw something like 1,000 students marching around campus. And it was interesting because if you ask students, is all of this because of that email? They would say it wasn't the email, but her email was emblematic of systemic racism or systemic bigotry or what have you on campus. And then that was just sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, because the university is inherently racist, and that was just more evidence of it. I maybe that was true, but then this is what I was thinking at the time today. I don't think it's true, but back then I was like, okay, maybe that's true, but then why are you guys trying to get her fired? I mean, like, if the university itself is, shouldn't we all be fired? Like, shouldn't like all the professors be fired? Shouldn't this university be shut down? Why are you targeting her then? But anyway, I ended up losing some friends over that. I sort of, I at that time on Facebook, for example, I don't know if Instagram was quite as big in 2015, but this was a Facebook thing specifically. People were posting something in response to that event, basically saying like, I stand against racism or something like that, similar to like the Black Square thing a few months ago with the Black Lives Matter stuff. And I didn't post anything, number one, because I was new to campus. I didn't know, I just didn't know enough about campus culture to have a strong opinion about it. I was still trying to learn, try to understand, like, it was just so different for me. So I didn't post anything. And then the student messaged me saying like, why aren't you posting this? What's going on? And I thought this person was kind of a friend, or at least, sort of had the potential to become a friend if we spent but it just, suddenly she totally stopped talking to me. I lost a couple of other friends for similar reasons, basically calling that whole episode into question about like, I could easily see myself or someone else, or like basically like the opinions expressed in that email to me were not at all inflammatory. The other thing that really, I guess, sort of shaped my view of Yale was, I lived off campus. I had an apartment in downtown New Haven. And Jansen, you probably know, right? Like downtown New Haven is, it's much different than the Yale bubble, right? Like there's a lot of poverty, a lot of homelessness, and it's disproportionately, African American. I would walk through the green, the sort of parkway through New Haven on my way back home from class, and I would hear from students about how how mean Yale is, and then I would see just basically like the most sort of depressing poverty that you can see in a U.S. city, right? And so I would think to myself like, okay, so these people claim to be sort of championing the underprivileged or the people who are who need help, and then I see what's going on in New Haven, and I mean, like, if sometimes I would walk through downtown New Haven with some of these students, and they would like get scared, right? Like one of my, maybe this is mean, but like one of my funniest, like to me, one of the funniest things was like to walk through with an undergrad, and then like someone would accost us for money, and they would like freeze, they get scared, because they just weren't used to interacting with people in poverty. But if that same person on campus would be all about the poor and how we should help them and so on. So that sort of subtle, or maybe not so subtle, hypocrisy also shaped my view of these students and how they're often, not always, but oftentimes concerned with saying the right thing, looking good to their immediate peers in their environment. But when it comes to actually doing something to help the people who really need it, they're not even familiar with that world, honestly. I mean, I could probably count on one hand the number of people who had any kind of upbringing that I had, in terms of just like poverty or family instability or chaos or anything like that. I was really shocked, actually. I didn't know this because I didn't read the statistics, right? Like the New York Times had that big thing, was it a couple of years ago, showing that Yale has more people from the top 1% than the bottom 50% or something like that. I didn't know that. Like I just thought like Yale, okay, maybe there's a lot of rich kids here, but I didn't know it was like that extreme. So yeah, I was just shocked at just like how few people like me were on campus. And then, yeah, I guess like in just that was one other thing that shaped my opinion.
Could we dive a little bit more into, I guess, campus culture and luxury beliefs? Because, and also we should also talk about cancel culture as well as sort of the greater trend, especially in light of what happened this past summer, the Black Lives Matter protests. I think that was kind of a shifting moment in terms of campus social discourse, which, to be very honest, I think I see both sides of the argument. People on the liberal left side would say this is such a horrible issue and such an urgent issue that needs our urgent attention. We should unconditionally really support those voices. And if you are against these, if I can't even agree with you on these most basic statistics or facts or history lessons, then I just cannot talk to you anymore. So I think I see that in the part of the discourse. So it's like, why wouldn't you talk to that guy? Yeah, because we're not in the same shared reality. That's what people on the liberal side would say. Because you and I disagree on the most basic facts of climate change or Black Lives Matter, I don't want to engage with you because you are not in good faith. And I guess that goes along with some of the other, I guess, subtle hypocrisies, Rob, that you're talking about, which is that kids probably care a little bit more about their actual experiences and talking about Black Lives Matter, even though they are part of the systemic forces that are creating huge inequality. They come from families that vouch for tax breaks for the rich or whatever. So,
right. Yeah, I think I mean, so one of the things that I mean, there's a lot of, I don't know, there was just a lot that happened over the summer, but I found it fascinating, and yeah, to some degree disheartening, just like how the most sort of vocal people were yeah, they were disproportionately affluent, well-to-do. I mean, there was that I think it was a survey, at least the Atlantic reported. I don't know if they actually did the original study, but the Atlantic reported that something like, if you look at left-wing activists, they're disproportionately. I mean, it was something like they're 3 times more likely to earn more than $100,000 a year, disproportionately likely to hold postgraduate degrees, disproportionately likely to be white. So if you look at the sort of the extreme left protest movement or activist wing of the left, yeah, they're more likely to be basically the sort of upper crust of American society. So to me, that's interesting. Yeah.
But Rob, could someone say because they're educated, because they're quote unquote woke, they're aware of those issues and they have the social resources to do it, they can better lead the movement, they can better raise awareness, and for those 10% to be shaping the discourse for the progress, that's a progressive sign for our society. Some would say.
Okay, so that might be true for some of them, but I think that one rebuttal to that would be, if you actually look at the statistics of what people want, and in terms of opinions and attitudes in American society, you've probably heard of this idea of the Great Awakening. It was sort of written, and I think it might have been coined by Zach Goldberg, who's a political science PhD student, but it's also been written about by others. Musa Al-Gharbi at Columbia, the tabloid journalist Wesley Yang. basically what they find is that uh, educated, affluent white liberals are far more to the left of Hispanic and Black voters on all kinds of issues. For example, the abolish the police movement. You may have seen some of these studies basically showing that like 80% of African Americans want either the same or more police protection in their neighborhoods. Whereas, if you ask people like, should we get rid of the police? The people who are most likely to say, yes, we should abolish or defund or whatever the police, it's the people who are most likely to answer yes to that are educated, affluent white liberals. And so the sort of, maybe they know something the rest of us don't, but I would argue that, people can probably, the typical working class Black voter probably knows better for themselves what they want than some highly educated white person who's never stepped foot in their neighborhood before. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's possible. A lot of their hearts are in the right places. I think that a lot of their intentions are sort of noble in intent maybe, but in terms of what people actually want, it's much different. It's just not what people seem to agree with. So
I guess it's also like the luxury class doesn't have much skin in the game as much as like poor people, and really he's never really interacted with that class and really know what it's like, and they're like upstairs in this ivory tower making all these propositions, all these ideas for people. So it's kind of like
yeah,
like the British government or something making policies in like Afghanistan or something like that. Is that
that's actually fairly no, that's a pretty good analogy. Yeah, I mean, people who maybe sort of glean ideas or opinions from what they read or from secondhand sources, but for people on the ground, they just have no familiarity and no contact with it. I mean, this is relates to my luxury beliefs idea that oftentimes the people who expound these beliefs and who help to shape policy never actually incur any of the costs associated with those beliefs. I mean, look, like obviously the police have done horrible things, but if you get rid of the police, like, I mean, there was a story, I think this was back in July, a bunch of people fled Manhattan and hired private security in the Hamptons, right? That like that's what rich people do. Like if there's no more police, then the only people who will have police are the rich. They may not be the sort of state police, but they will hire private security. There are I mean other examples of this, but like that's sort of a more, I guess, salient or relevant one at the moment.
Well, Rob, I guess
yeah.
So I guess we don't have to go into the policy details of what defund the police and such and so on, but there is one curious follow-up I would love to ask you about, which is how you actually get a sense of who's dominating the social discourse and what is the public actually feeling about. So for example, you cite the statistic of maybe saying this group of people actually are not that left. But it may be, for me, I've read the exact opposite statistic or fact from some survey that says 2/3 of America support broad police reform, or 3/4 of Americans support the Black Lives Matter movement. So you see from these things, especially if people from my source, especially these days, kids use Instagram stories for literally their news. So you scroll through Instagram and you realize all those screenshots of those statistics that basically tell you a very cohesive picture of how people are reckoning systemic racism and such and so on. So even, and people from the right could come up with a solid set of statistics that back up their opinion. I think perhaps one good test of that was the 2020 election and see how people actually voted. And we didn't see the blue wave. We didn't see that dramatic shift of a shift towards the left. The progressives didn't dominate the discourse to the extent that they imagined. But maybe that's one way to test what's actually going on. But we saw from the polls, from the surveys, from the statistics, nothing's really that accurate. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you actually get a sense of whether there's 10% or 80% or 90%.
Yeah. I mean, that's a that's a good example. I mean, election outcomes. I remember, a lot of people I know at Cambridge, some of my Yale friends too, who were, a little bit disappointed during the Democrat primaries when it became like very clear that Joe Biden was about to be the nominee, because I think like Biden was viewed as and sort of positioned himself as the sort of center left, sort of moderate candidate, and a lot of people I knew, highly educated people, they wanted Bernie Sanders, they wanted Elizabeth Warren, they wanted someone who was more to the left, but the sort of median Democrat voter wanted someone more like Joe Biden. As far as like, I guess we can all sort of craft narratives with statistics. I think one, something maybe more unfortunate is that like you can tell a story and based on how surveys are worded. So you mentioned before, like, maybe, yeah, 2/3 of Americans want broad police reform, but then, people will read that word reform in different ways, depending on their own biases and preconceived notions and political opinions and so on. And, for better or worse, the people who are most likely to read into those the way they want to are highly educated people. You know, similar to this idea that the highest people who occupy the highest social positions in society are also the ones who care the most about status. Well, they also care the most about expressing the right political opinions to their group. And so, for example, I think he's a political psychologist at Yale, Dan Kahan. He's found, for example, that the people who are the most concerned about climate change are highly educated Democrats. And the people who are the least concerned about climate change are college-educated Republicans. So what you find is that less educated people, regardless of their political orientation, have roughly the same level of concern about climate change, right? So they're sort of like similarly, they both sort of care or whatever. But then, as Democrats gain more education, they become very concerned, and as Republicans gain more education, they become less concerned. So the gap actually widens. The more education you obtain, or whatever, the more whatever clever you happen to be, or so. And I think this is something that's going on right now with the sort of the discourse, which is mostly most of the participants tend to be educated people.
I actually watched a really interesting documentary recently called The Social Dilemma, and talks about social media and how it affects truth. And one thing that really struck me was that, like, in Google, right, depending on the region, you search, is climate change something like blah, blah, blah. Like in like a heavily democratic region, it says climate change getting worse, climate change like gonna, like, are the oceans gonna rise or whatever. But in like a very Republican area, the algorithm, like the autofill would be like, is climate change a hoax? So I guess that plays a huge impact on how, like, the polarization in society, and how, yeah, we don't have a solid truth base to argue on, to have discourse around.
There's no shared reality anymore if you don't want shared realities to exist. And I how would that, I guess, affect human nature, luxury beliefs, and going back to your research, Rob?
Yeah.
And kind of to add on to, sorry. I read one article you shared on Twitter, actually. It's about the Weimarization of the American Republic. It's about like how Germany, yeah. And I was just curious on, like, I read like a lot of history and see like there's a constant theme of polarization happening like over and over again. I guess like what forces society to polarize, and what kind of, basically.
Yeah, these are all these are good questions. So yeah, I mean, as far as like the polarization question, what forces society, or what causes? I mean, there are multiple different causes. One interesting cause is basically you're sort of, I mean, people tend to want to be around the people that they get along with the most, right? And so, I mean, this is sort of, I guess this is a somewhat provocative idea, but this was suggested, I think, in a psychology paper I read earlier this year. Basically, what happens is that in a society where people can more easily relocate, so you can live wherever you want in the modern world, it's much easier to pick up and move to a different city. Over time, people start to congregate, like they physically live in the places that they enjoy living in, and those places tend to be people who are very similar to themselves. right? And this is all the more true for people with means, right? People with money, people who are educated, they're of course the most likely to pack up and leave and congregate in neighborhoods with one another. And so as the free movement of people, they start to sort of cluster together and spend more time with each other, amplify their views. Group polarization can take hold. So the idea of group polarization was originally discovered as a social psychology idea from the 1960s. So basically the idea is that when people express like tepid ideas that they're not sure about to each other, then those beliefs magnify. And so the original study was something like they brought a bunch of people together and they all sort of, this was in France, so they all sort of didn't really like Charles de Gaulle very much. I think this was a study. And then they let these people speak for a few minutes. And then at the end of the conversation, all of their beliefs had magnified. And now they were all sure, like, yeah, this guy was really not a great leader. Or maybe it was a good leader, but either way. Or, for example, like if you take the three of us, you put us in a room, and let's say that all of us sort of like vanilla ice cream, but we're not sure, but we kind of like, and so then I say like, yeah, I kind of like it. You say you kind of like it. And then after we sort of talk about ice cream for a while, at the end of the conversation, all of us will be much more certain that vanilla ice cream is the best ice cream. And so this also happens online. It happens in person, where we all sort of reflect opinions back at one another, and then those beliefs harden and strengthen, in part because we all want to sort of get along with the group. None of us want to be the person who is counteracting or dissenting. And of course, each time you express that belief and other people see, then they get the message that like that's the opinion you're supposed to express. So there's two things going on here. One is that people sort of congregate both in person and online toward their favorite groups. And then as they continue to share ideas with one another, they become more certain and more confident in them. I want to say though that like, I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I guess I guess I've just been thinking about like how important is it to have a completely accurate like mental representation of reality, even though in the US, of course, like all of us have different political views and maybe we're reading the statistics in different ways and so on and so forth. If you take like a very like sort of broad historical view or even cross-cultural view, almost nobody has the same mental representation of reality. I mean, in terms of like different religious views, different views about like how the world came to be. For most of human history, we didn't actually know the truth about anything, right? Like the scientific method has only been around for a few hundred years. For most of history, we didn't need to know the truth, but we still got along, right? We still sort of survived. We still sort of like made it. So I'm thinking more and more about like the importance of truth in the first place. I personally enjoy it. I read a lot. I try to be as accurate as possible in my thoughts and beliefs. But at the same time, like I think there's this sort of undercurrent in the kind of conversations that we're having about like, well, why wouldn't people want to know the truth? And of course the truth is important. And how could people not want to know the truth? And why are they saying lies to one another? Truth, like it's just, it's actually not been that important historically. Most people haven't had the sort of scientifically accurate beliefs. This is a very recent idea, so that's something else to keep in mind as well. I'm not sure what to do with it, but this is just something that I've been thinking about as far as like, it helps me at least to not be so upset that people aren't trying to learn the truth.
So we hear a lot of the discourse today that's every time I interview someone and I ask them their concern for today's political socio environment is, they would say the deviation from facts and truth. We interviewed Axio CEO Jim Vanderhei. He said people don't do that anymore. Somehow everybody's operating on different shared realities. And do you see this as so you said this is kind of a recent phenomenon. People are relying on scientific truth and such and so on. But where is this country headed? I mean, I guess in this direction, will people just be operating under two completely different shared realities? I mean, do you foresee a civil war going in the United States in 10, 15 years? Like because people are just...
I don't know. I mean, I honestly, I couldn't even tell you, man. Like for me, like I've tried to refrain from predicting things, just because, like, I mean, a year ago, right? Like last Christmas, did anyone know that 2020 would be the way that it was, right? Like, would we know that there was a deadly pandemic and all the stuff that happened? Um, I don't think so, right? Like, so a year from now, who knows how things are going to go? Um, but as far as, like, are we going to live in these divergent realities? And I mean, probably. Uh, I mean, people are going to want to consume the content that they want. They're going to want to sort of get along with the group that they like the most, and sort of get along with the most, their friends, their peers, their groups. Um, I don't know if it's going to turn into violence. I think a lot of this is just sort of like, I think Ross Douthat talked about this in his recent book, The Decadent Society. It was something like, the Civil War is just going to be played out on social media. It's going to be played out on Twitter. We're all just going to keep posting memes and making fun of each other and dunking or whatever. But I just don't think that, like, people are really going to come to blows. I mean, even all of the demonstrations and protests in the U.S. over the summer. I mean, of course, a lot of bad things happened, but, like, there were remarkably few actual homicides and murders. So I don't know. It's hard to say with that one. I'm also not even sure, really, like I said before, about, like, the importance of like living in that that shared reality. Somehow, even though we all say maybe we believe in different things, like, you might believe in this, and then this other person of a different political orientation believes in that, and neither one of you knows what's going on. Somehow both of you manage to get up and go to work and take care of your families and do the things that you actually need to do day to day. A lot of the opinions that we express are less to do with trying to, like, say something true, and more to do with just, like, trying to get along with the group.
I guess another question we were thinking about is that we read in your New York Times articles that we talked about how your foster child made you conservative in some sense. You emphasize the importance of personal responsibility, and you say that if you had been told that you were a victim when you were a kid, you would never have made it to where you are now. And the emphasis on individual responsibility is now obviously seen as a more conservative idea, has that kind of policy. At least when people hear about individual responsibility, they think that's a Republican policy. And J.D. Vance talked about that in Hillbilly Elegy, and you mentioned that at the beginning of the interview as well. So I was wondering, just what are your thoughts on the values of our current, so what Jansen would say, the postmodern society, and how they affect people growing up in? So we're talking about social discourse. We're talking about this. Even the elites somehow they're much more concerned for the poor, but they're more disconnected from the poor, as you observed from Yale. So where are we headed next? I mean, again, not asking you to make predictions. When I say where are we headed next, I want to hear your thoughts.
Sure. I mean, I think the importance of personal responsibility. I think it's not, there's not enough emphasis placed on it. So on the one hand, I I agree, actually. Like, since I wrote that article 2 years ago, the op-ed in the New York Times, I've I've somewhat shifted a little bit. I still think it's very important, but I've sort of come around to this idea that, like, look, there are a lot of companies and a lot of, like, basically, you have tech companies and media companies and so on, who have, like, vast sums of money, and many of them hire very smart behavioral scientists who are trying to nudge us and to get us to do things that, maybe we didn't want to do, but we just feel compelled to. I think that this was one of the points, maybe in that Social Dilemma documentary or something. There's some documentary on Netflix about this, about social media and its effects on us and so on. And so, as an individual, how much power do you have in the face of, whatever social media company trying to get you to click on ads or click on the next thing or watch these videos, the strength of these algorithms? On the other hand, I think we can hold both of those ideas in mind at the same time, that, like, yes, the environment is very powerful. There are a lot of sort of social forces and a lot of money moving around to get us to behave in certain ways. But at the same time, we are still sort of in control of ourselves. We can still choose to some degree how to respond to the circumstances, whether it happens to be poverty or whether it happens to be sort of getting caught in a sort of social media Skinner box or whatever. One example that I read was pretty interesting was this book, Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, who was a psychiatrist. He wrote a book about his experiences in a concentration camp, World War II. And he described how, even though all of the prisoners were in, I mean, basically the worst possible environment you could find yourself in, still there were people who behaved in more noble and less noble ways, even though all of them were basically in the same tragic, horrible circumstances. There was still sort of variation in their responses and how they chose to help each other or not. So I do think that even if you're in the sort of most dire of circumstances, you can still, to some degree, have control over how you react to it.
Yeah, I guess back to your previous point on postmodernism, Tiger. I guess, and I took this really cool class at Yale called Truth and Post-Truth, taught by Marcy Shore. I don't know if you've taken that class before, Rob.
I took a class with her. I took what is it? European intellectual history since Nietzsche.
Oh yeah, I did a course like that too. But like, I think she put it really, really clearly. Like postmodernism, like before postmodernism, like philosophy is just trying to replace existing blocks with better blocks, but postmodernism just kind of melted everything away. So people right now don't really have anything to like hold on to. So I guess Jordan Peterson is just a direct response to postmodernism, because I feel like back to the man's search for meaning part, like a lot of people now don't really have meaning in their lives. And I think Jordan Peterson kind of is a very like talks about like bringing conservative ideas of myths and all that to kind of ground people and have them take personal responsibility. But I guess it's a kind of good segue into the question I really wanted to ask you, because I've been reading a lot of your newsletters and talking about our like human nature, our like natural like biological tendencies. And I was just kind of curious on like what are some things that are so innate in human nature that well, no matter what we do, we won't be able to get rid of them. And like, what do you think is like the best political system that allows humans to enact their nature and kind of suppress bad things, like bad parts of it? Because I guess like Christakis' husband kind of writes similar to that. I haven't really gone into it, but just want to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah. I mean, so one of the, one of the themes that I touch on in the newsletter, something that I consider to be sort of more innate, something that's cross cultural, and this is actually sort of borne out in the research, psychology, anthropology, is the fact that we all care deeply about social status. We all care about sort of respect and admiration from our peers, regardless of how much we may sort of deny or distance ourselves from that idea. And of course, like based on historical factors, based on culture. I mean, it varies from person to person and from group to group and culture to culture how that's expressed. But I tweeted this I shared this post on Twitter a while back. It was something like, you might say that you don't care about status, but if you get a group of people together who all say that, then they're all going to compete to see who cares the least about status. Well, I care the least. So that's something that we all care to some degree or another about. And part of this is because of the ancestral environment from which we came. Human beings haven't changed that much since we left the Pleistocene, the Savannah, 100,000 years ago or so, depending on the specific anthropological record you're looking at, but roughly 100,000 years ago. And in that environment, a human can't survive alone. You can't just drop an early Homo sapien in the forest and just let them go. Like they're gonna die by the end of the week, but if you drop 100 of them together, they're all going to work together. They all have to sort of coordinate. That has been our species' strength. This is something that Nicholas Christakis has written about in his book Blueprint, about how, you know, cooperation and care and looking after one another, you know, these are the sort of positive aspects of human nature. But of course, there can be downsides because we care so much about how we're viewed by others. That can take a darker turn. You know, how, like, what is the best political system? Like, I don't know, man. I think this has been debated at length since Locke or before. I don't even know, Aristotle. Like, all the smart guys have been thinking about this idea forever. I think that so you know, to bring it back to Jordan Peterson, I remember a quote of his. I might be butchering it to some extent, but I remember him saying that, like, you know, if you sort of look at, like, you know, all of the societies that have existed throughout history, like, any system that isn't actively trying to kill you is actually a pretty good system. And just because of, like, the amount of tragedy, you know, throughout our species history. So I think that the one we have now, there are a lot of complaints, a lot of imperfections, you know, a lot of work to do. But I think we all live, like, pretty good lives. You know, I have my share of complaints and critiques. Especially, you know, maybe if you follow me on Twitter, you've seen, like, in some of my writing too, about the deterioration of family life in the U.S., especially among more working class families. But, you know, in terms of, like, the historical median, we're all doing pretty good in the system.
Rob, so we talked about cancel culture. We talked about how people are under social influences and they might feel pressured to maybe this is not a good analogy, but follow the herd. And when I subscribe to your newsletter, your first newsletter, your welcoming newsletter, tells the story that we've already talked about, which is the Yale professor who was forced to resign over unpopular email, Jordan Peterson being disinvited from Cambridge. We cited those examples. But when I asked a lot of people on the left of these, you know, cases of cancel culture, they would say, yes, we agree they're problematic, but these are very fringe cases. These are a speckle of truth being overblown. And the larger trends is that we are in a rapid shift of societal norms towards the better, towards progress. So I wanted to hear you, because you say one of the trends you are seeing in institutions is these social mobs cancel people for dissenting against orthodoxy. You say that, but how severe is this phenomenon? How bad is it to, because some people just say we acknowledge it exists, but it's just not that bad.
Yeah. I mean, there's been some interesting research on this. The political scientists James Gibson and Joseph Sutherland recently released a paper called "Keeping Your Mouth Shut: like spiraling self-censorship in the U.S. Over the last however many decades." And basically found is that self-censorship is on the rise. Self-censorship defined as, like, basically, do you feel free to express your beliefs in public? It's continued to climb. In the 1950s, the height of McCarthyism, something like 13% of Americans said they didn't feel free to express themselves. In 1980, it was something like 20%. And in 2019, it was 40%. And this wasn't a partisan issue either, interestingly. I think, like, cancel culture and this kind of, like, often associated with the left. I think it's probably more associated with, like, the far left, the fringe left, because I often notice that they will cancel sort of center left people as well. But there's no partisan difference. So roughly 40% of Republicans and 40% of Democrats say that they do not feel free to express themselves, and it's been climbing. It's other research has shown that the people who are, you know, if you break it down by political orientation and education, the higher up in education you go, the more concerned you are to express yourself, and the more concerned you are you might get fired for saying the wrong political belief. So it's pretty low. I think for people with a high school education only, something like 25% say they're concerned about getting fired for saying the wrong thing. And then by the time you get to the postgraduate level, it's above 50%. So, you know, basically, like, it is growing. If you ask people themselves, So I guess like maybe some of the people you speak about, maybe they might say something like, well, they're just mistaken. But I don't think people just like randomly come to the conclusion like, you know, I don't see why it would double since 1980 that like, oh, now we can't express ourselves anymore. Regardless of your political orientation, people are thinking this way. It's happening in university campuses too. Over time, more and more university students have said that they are afraid to express their beliefs in classrooms and to their peer groups. So, and of course, like we're seeing examples of it. I think we often see the most like the most famous or well-known cases of this. So, you know, the Christakis case, Jordan Peterson, sort of like well-known public figures. Most of us hear the news of. We often don't hear the lesser-known cases of just your sort of typical white-collar worker works in an office in a cubicle somewhere and, you know, posted a meme somewhere and then they get fired. This happens more often than we think. So I mean, I think we can also just sort of intuitively understand it. Like, do you personally feel free to say everything that you want to say at Princeton or at Yale or at Cambridge? And for me, at least, the answer is no. And I'm probably more, expressive than most of my friends or my peers in terms of like criticisms and so forth. So I think it's a serious problem. And we all, I think, not all of us, but many of us, I think we are sort of pretending that it's not, and we're all sort of hoping that it will go away or that it's just a fashionable trend that will blow over. But yeah, I think in the meantime, one thing that's happening is it's actually creating a barrier for upward mobility. I wrote about this in a piece in the Wall Street Journal about how moral fashions are changing so fast that like now if you want to enter the upper class, it's hard, man. Like it was hard for me 5-6 years ago. Like I was reading The Atlantic, I was reading New York, like I said, I was reading all this, and even then, like I still didn't quite get what it was like at a place like Yale, like what's acceptable to say or not, or what will sort of like garner approval versus disapproval. And so now, like I think it's especially hard. You know, you have to sort of like keep up on the latest trends, and this is hard to do when you're just trying to make ends meet. So we talked earlier about political polarization, the left and the right, or Democrats and Republicans, whatever. I think the bigger, the more sort of potentially troublesome gap is between sort of white collar and blue collar, and what they believe and what's sort of culturally acceptable or not in their environments. I think that an educated Republican and an educated Democrat have much more in common with each other than either one of them do with a working class person.
Yes, I think that's a perfect segue into talking about social mobility and higher education, which is something you also write about and are quite critical of the current direction that we're headed. I guess to start off, I remember reading your New York Times, a New York Post article. You criticize educated people's emphasis on college diplomas for underprivileged kids, saying that the focus should be on stabilizing families instead, and that education is really a red herring. So you said, we can try to get more foster kids to go to college, but as a starting point, we should try to keep them out of jail. That starts at home. So what do you think as an alternative for social mobility currently right now in terms of, is it more education investment in public education, into non-liberal arts college education, for example, vocational training, trade school, that kind of degree programs? Or do we do what a lot of these huge universities are doing, which is expanding financial aid, letting more diverse kids come in? And there's also the whole thing about affirmative action that we don't have to go into, but seems to be quite a complex landscape right now.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, and that was, I didn't even want to like touch on any of that, but the editor of that piece was like, we want to hear some sort of personal reflection about this or what we should do about it.
It's New York Post, Rob. It's New York Post, so you gotta.
They all want to. Yeah, you can't just say something. They also want to. What do we do about it, right? And so, I just think that we put way too much emphasis on education in the U.S. and maybe just like in the sort of whatever in the UK as well. But basically, like my point there was that like why are we all focusing like why are we all focusing on trying to get everyone into college? Like why do we think that that's the only way to, like you say, achieve open mobility? The other point that I was trying to make is that look, even if every single like kid in poverty or every foster kid goes to Princeton or Yale, they're still going to be carrying like the scars of their childhood. Like it doesn't matter if you have an Ivy League degree if you have undergone like serious trauma, right? And so like who cares if you're making six figures, right? Like you're not going to obtain that kind of fulfillment and happiness if you lived like a really tough life as a little kid, and those early life experiences are disproportionately influential on our psychology later on in life. So you know it's something that basically I think we should be focused much more on the beginning of life rather than adulthood, right? Like we're all focusing on what happens when kids turn 18 and where they go next, but why don't we start focusing on like what happens when they first come into the world and what those first 18 years are like? I mean, there's some really interesting, speculations on why we do this. There's psychologist Alice Miller who's observed that when you read the biographies of great figures in history, oftentimes they sort of gloss over their childhoods. They say like so and so had a tough childhood and their mom was mean and suddenly they're in high school or whatever and now they're off inventing something or whatever. And Alice Miller suggests that like oftentimes these great people had like really really tough lives as kids, really underwent a lot of neglect or abuse or whatever, and people just don't want to read about it. It's too painful to read, so they just gloss over it. I think we should focus more on that. Try to keep kids out of jail, and what I meant by that was like give them the kind of childhood where they are not on the track to get into trouble, where they have some at-home supervision, where they have someone looking after them, whatever, making sure they do homework, making sure they're staying out of trouble. In that the Hillbilly Elegy movie, right? Like, you saw the J.D. Vance character or whatever, smoking weed and doing dumb things, but he had his mama who was like trying to keep him away from those kids and trying to keep him on track. And I think having a figure like that is we should be focusing more on something like that rather than like let's try to get every kid into college or whatever. I think the vocation school idea is good too. Just to be perfectly frank, like a lot of kids don't like school very much. They're not interested in working in an office job or wearing a tie to work every day. That's not the ideal life for a lot of people. They'd rather be working with their hands or doing something sort of more physical. I think about my friends in high school and how their lives turned out. So I had 5 close friends in high school, and 2 of them ended up in prison. One of them works at a supermarket. One of them works at a car wash. One of them joined the military like me, and now he's in a community college, and he seems to sort of not be doing as well as he wants to do. So a lot of people, they sort of see examples like me or examples like JD and think like, oh, well, you send a young kid off to the military and then they'll get their life together, and then when they get out, they'll end up at Yale or whatever. But that's not the norm. Like even when guys who have the childhood that I had go to the military and they get out, like oftentimes, whatever demons they had catch up with them later, and they don't end up having the happily ever after story of Hollywood movies or whatever. So I think that we should try to focus more on not every kid may go to Yale, but we can give more kids decent childhoods, I think.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of this interesting stat I read like a couple months ago. I think like in 1960s, most kids kind of grew up in like 2-parent households, but then right now I don't know what the number is, but I think the number is like around 50. Correct me if I'm wrong. And I guess this goes back to
that study. I posted that a while back actually, and so this is from it's either from political scientist Robert Putnam, who's at Harvard, or Charles Murray, the political scientist at AEI. But basically, the finding was that in 1960, if you look at affluent and working class families, in 1960, 95% of affluent families and working class families, children were raised by both of their birth parents in 1960. And then by 2005, the number for affluent families was 85% of children raised by both of their birth parents. And for working class families, it had dropped to 30%. So essentially, since 1960, affluent families have remained the same, more or less. And for working class families, it has completely just deteriorated. I remember when I was at, I was in a class at Yale, actually. This was, I think, my second year or something. The professor, so this was like a psychology of the family class or something. Christy Lockhart is the name. And so she basically gave us an anonymous survey, an anonymous poll that we answered. And it was, how many of you grew up with both of your birth parents? And it was a seminar of 25 people. And out of 25 people, there were only 2 people who did not grow up with both of their birth parents. It was me and another student. So that's, less than 10%. And if you look at the research for other elite schools, I think Cornell, there was a study, 15 years ago or something, which roughly showed that like 10% of the students weren't raised by their birth parents. So that, like, the family life is another. I mean, there's so many differences in terms of, upper class and working class culture. But one is just like, your typical person, your typical kid in a working class neighborhood doesn't live with their dad, may not know who their dad is. Like, it's just like, so me, I mentioned I had 5 friends. Out of the 6 of us, 0 of us were raised by both of our birth parents. I of course live with my adoptive mother, my adoptive father, severed ties with me. Another friend, he lived with his dad and his mom had left. Another friend was raised by his grandmother because his dad was in jail and his mom was addicted to drugs. Like, these kinds of stories are the norm in sort of more, lower middle class to working class neighborhoods. And it's basically unheard of among the affluent.
Yeah. So how do you think society or like the government should like help address this kind of issue? Because it's very, it's more societal / cultural instead of governmental.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, it's I'm not sure if there's any sort of special policy. I've actually talked to this other guy on another podcast recently about some just sort of spitballing ideas. And there was one analogy that I had come up with about smoking and how in 1960, like, I don't know what the percentage was, but it was like, basically a large percentage of Americans smoked cigarettes. And today, very few. So there was like a sort of public awareness campaign. So they didn't actually outlaw cigarettes, right? They didn't outlaw them. They didn't ban them. They didn't throw people in jail for smoking. But there was this sort of awareness campaign of like, if you smoke cigarettes, here's what can happen. Every single packet of cigarettes has the warning label. They sort of de-glamorized it in media and culture. I think like the old TV shows in the 60s, I Love Lucy, they would be smoking cigarettes or whatever, and then it became sort of taboo on network television to show characters smoking. So they sort of de-glamorized it. And I think maybe we could do something similar with families. I think that people may respond poorly to this and think that they're being judged or whatever. But I thought that, like, for example, you could put up posters or billboards or something on subways or public areas that say like, kids who are raised by both of their parents are 3 times more likely to graduate from high school, or on average earn this much more money, or this much less likely to stay out of prison, and just sort of put those out there. And because I think most people don't know this, they don't know what's going on with families and childhood outcomes based on family structure. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be about education or money. It can be about like likelihood of going to prison, or likelihood of becoming addicted to drugs, or all kinds of different things. So I think like one could be just sort of this public awareness campaign. It would have to be done in a sensitive way, of course, but it's possible that just sort of putting the information out there might shift things a little.
Rob, another issue that's been on my mind, and I think underlying train of thought throughout our conversation is that you cannot devise simple solutions where you simply put a kid in an environment and expect everything to work out, which is what you said. And there's been all kinds of political science and economic studies about this. So we had a Berkeley economics professor, Ilona de Renancourt, on the show a couple months ago, and she was talking about how during the Great Migration, if you just move the Black people from South to the North, it doesn't improve their outcomes that much better, because what happens is they move to those cities in the North that used to have a lot of great resources, but you see the white flight, right? White people simply leave and create their own neighborhoods. So the Black people simply end up in another bad place. So you cannot just do migration and give people housing vouchers. And we see that same thing, which is like educational vouchers. You give people financial aid and subsidies. So Jansen and I went to the same boarding school. In our boarding school, I think what we observed is that you can have low-income kids and minority kids come into this school, but they will simply be excluded from, the rich kid circles, or they simply are kind of being seen as the bottom rung of the social ladder in the high school microcosm kind of social hierarchy. And they probably do even worse. They probably feel horrible. They have all kinds of mental burden. So I think that's kind of the messaging that we've been trying to get here, which is that there seems to need a cultural, societal shift there. And I think there seems to be a greater disconnect between the kids in elitist institutions like Princeton and like Yale, who are going to soon become the ruling class, but they're increasingly disconnected from the rest of the society, even though Yale and Princeton are behind these campaigns that are actually admitting more low-income students than ever. Every year, there's like from 30% to 4% full ride, whatever. That it's getting increasingly diverse. We're focusing more on social justice. But it seems that when you have those kids in those institutions after they're admitted, that doesn't mean they'll have a good time. And that seems to be a greater issue than just admitting them.
Yeah, I think was there not there was either like a book or a big paper about this, about like it had like some kind of clever name, like being underprivileged in a privileged place or something like that. Basically what happens when you put like people from low income backgrounds in elite institutions, and the sort of the burden that they carry with them. Yeah, I really don't know if there's like any like I wouldn't know what the solution is for something like that. I think it's important, of course, to like have that kind of diversity of views and backgrounds, and yeah, if we can identify more talented people from dire circumstances and help them up, that's great. But of course, like once they get there, what do you do? At least for me, my way of managing it was to just like find people who were similar, or at least as similar as I could find, who understood what it was like, and sort of like just talk about it together, and to just sort of learn, like, well, what have you learned about this place? And I'll share what I've learned about it, and sort of navigate it in that way. But yeah, it will never be as easy for a low income kid to integrate fully into a place like Princeton or Yale as it is for someone who went to Exeter. It's just not never going to be like that. In the same way, I mean, it's not just to do with like because you didn't have enough money or something. Like it's a cultural issue. A kid from Exeter is going to have so like if you take a blue collar kid and put him in another blue collar neighborhood, they'll integrate pretty quick. But if you take the kid from Exeter and try to put him in that neighborhood, he or she's going to have a really tough time, right? It's a cultural issue. And I'm not sure if like whatever, if you try to create like a integrating into a low income neighborhood program and like putting this Exeter kid through it, and like I'm just not sure like how much they're going to glean, or if it's really going to help that much. But I think that like I wouldn't even know who would put it together, or like what would be contained in this like packet. But like one idea just off the top of my head would be to sort of like do what I did, but in a more sort of structured way, which is to say that like if you're a low income kid and you sort of win the lottery and get into Stanford or Princeton or whatever, like here is a list of sort of like cultural cultural sort of artifacts and articles and interesting things that you should know about the kind of people you're about to be spending a lot of time with. Um, Even things like what I mentioned before, like 85% of these people live with both of their birth parents. Like even that simple fact would like, I think sort of help people to understand where these people are coming from, what it's like there, and how different it is from the way that you grew up or the way that I grew up in this case, you know? So I would know, like, and of course there would be so, like, I think this would be politically fraught because people would say like, well, why should we include that article? And are you trying to brainwash these low income kids or whatever? Like it would be challenging for sure. If anyone tried to do this in an official way, but maybe I could do this. Maybe I could put something together in my unofficial way. But I think this is one thing that could help. And I think the reverse would be good too. If you manage to get into an elite school, regardless of your income, I think it would be useful to have some kind of class or some kind of like reading list for privileged students to understand what life is like for the other side, the other half.
Rob, we do have those readings. I don't know, anti-racist readings. We have the whole reading list of anti-privilege, by the way, I'm not making a politicized statement here. I'm just saying the schools are really trying. See, they're really genuinely trying to integrate and trying to bridge the gaps between diversity, but it seems that they're not bridging the gaps between people because it seems to be less of a, not saying there isn't a racial divide, but there's a class divide, a socioeconomic divide, there's a cultural divide that is so great.
Yeah. I mean, and you know what, like, fair enough. Like, I get it. Like, maybe I haven't read that book, but like, if people think that that's important to like help, whatever, fine, put it on the list. But like, I think you should also put other readings on the list as well that maybe have a different perspective. Look, racism is a problem, but I think that social class is also something that is more overlooked. Say, like, I think a lot of students at elite colleges are very concerned with racism and think a lot about it and want to do the right thing by that. But I think because class is so often neglected and overlooked, that's something that maybe we could also focus on alongside those other concerns. I don't know what book it would be. Dignity is, just one book off the top of my head that's a fairly light read in terms of like the density of the complexity of the reading, say, but like in terms of the content, this is pretty heavy, emotionally heavy. Chris Arnade, the author of the book, basically like went around the country and spent time like sitting in diners and churches and poor neighborhoods, talking to people all across the U.S., poor, white, Hispanic, Black, whatever, all races, all sort of whatever backgrounds, and sort of wrote about his experiences and took pictures of their living circumstances, where they spent their days, what it was like for them. And I think like just sort of spending a little bit of time going through, learning about that could go a long way to helping people to understand the country more.
Yeah.
I guess in like colleges, I kind of see like everyone just putting everything on, like blaming everything on race. Like they're not really looking at the big picture and not really seeing things more nuanced and not thinking of second order consequences. So
there was there's this scholar at Penn. I think he's a Marxist scholar, actually. I can't remember his name or her name. I just read this article by this person, basically critiquing this idea of the way that we talk about racism in the discourse. Basically, this person says that like people are perfectly fine with the way things are as long as the 1% is exactly reflective of the country as a whole. So it should be whatever, like this person, it should be 16% Black, 16% Hispanic, 6% Asian, and this percent white, this percent LGBT. Like basically everything in the country can remain the same as long as the elite look like the way that we want it to look like, rather than actually trying to change and understand and whatever, restructure. I didn't agree with all of it, but in that sense, I sort of got it, that like my impression oftentimes among among highly educated people is that they care more about representation, meaning like whoever's elite, as long as they sort of reflect the makeup of the country, then the sort of the social and economic system is totally fine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like the equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity debate.
Yeah, to some degree, yeah, I think there is this desire. Well, kind of. I think even that is not exactly accurate. I don't think it's like equality of outcome uh, in terms of like, yeah, in terms of class or whatever, but I think more equality of outcome in terms of like we want the makeup of Yale to look exactly this way, even though you know, even though like the black and the Hispanic students are still like from the top 1% of American families, oftentimes. Um, yeah, like very like yeah, very few people, like I said before, like very few people actually came from tough socioeconomic backgrounds. So it seems to be more about like looking diverse rather than being diverse.
Yeah.
Um, I think so when Chance and I were in high school, we had some naive solutions, which is like, don't admit the legacy kids who are assholes. I mean, like, yeah, his grandpa went to this school, but like, he's clearly an asshole. Like you see the kid when you interview, and you know that kid's gonna haze and bully some other poor kid when he gets it. Like you can see that. Like yes, his family is donating a ton of money, but like just get rid of those kids. Like I don't know. So Yale has what's it called? Secret societies, right? You guys have those secret societies. Princeton has eating clubs. Harvard has finals clubs, whatever those things are called, right? Horrendous, absolutely horrible.
One thing I found interesting was Skull and Bones, like the most known Yale secret society. I don't think it has taken a single white male in a very long time.
What, dude?
Yeah.
What are you say? What?
That's what
I've heard this too. To be fair, yeah. I don't know how long it's been, but I've heard that like it's yeah, they sort of like have very few yeah, white male members. Again, this is just something I've heard. Maybe it's not even true, but yeah, I've heard this as well. I on the legacy idea, I think that this like I don't like the idea, but I'm not. Yeah, I guess we could try to get rid of it. I mean, I have no strong feelings one way or the other, but I remember I talked to this yeah this female student at Yale. She was a first generation student. I think her parents were immigrants. Yeah, so she she's sort of like relative to most Yale students, is from a sort of tougher life, and we were talking about legacy. She said like, oh, like I would get rid of legacy instantly. Like I think it's so bad. And then I asked her, I told I said, well, you want to go to law school, you're probably going to be a very successful person. And when your kid gets older, do you think that they should get some, some special, consideration for Yale admissions if they should apply here? And she said, well, yeah. I mean, I worked really hard. Like, I worked really hard to give them this opportunity. So I think that this, and so like, I think that there's this mindset like, even if you're a first gen student and, you believe that legacy should be dismantled, but then when you have kids, suddenly you want a legacy admission consideration. So I think it's going to be really hard to get rid of it. I personally like, I've read enough research. Like my sort of reading of everything is that like, if you and your spouse are smart and care for your kid and have resources, then the kid's going to turn out fine, basically. But I know that a lot of the sort of helicopter parents are preoccupied and there's that varsity blue scandal and all that stuff, trying to bribe their kids in.
So I think what one of my friends was and I were just chatting last night. He was like, "This is what you do. You go to those global corporations that are dodging taxes, or you go to the Hamptons, or you go to one of those secret societies. You go to them and you just bring out the guillotines, and you just and you just start the revolution, and then 2 minutes in, everybody would be like, okay, why don't we just do the 80% income tax? Why don't we abolish this?
I find it fascinating that like that revolutionary spirit is
right.
is much more apparent in very affluent people, because like I think one issue is that like if you're at Yale, for example, and you're like, people tend to compare themselves upward. Like they have this upward social comparison. So if you're upper middle class and your family makes $500,000 a year and you're at Yale, you're not comparing, like, you're not, you think of yourself as middle class because you are looking at the kids of the billionaires, the kids of the legacies who come from these, old iconic American families or whatever. Like, even though you make 10 times more than the median American, or your family makes 10 times more than the median American family, you're still viewing yourself as like a little bit downtrodden. Like, I'm not doing as well as even though I'm in the 1%, I'm not in the 0.01%, and therefore we need to have a revolution. Like that is the mindset that I'm seeing. Whereas if you actually look at the person in the 50th percentile of income in the US, they don't want to overthrow the country. Like, they're just trying to make ends meet. They want to like take care of their families. Like, they just want to like sort of live a normal life. They're not looking to like bring a guillotine to Jeff Bezos' house the way that a lot of these other like sort of upper middle class students and graduates are. It's very interesting to me. You guys have maybe seen some of like Peter Turchin's work on intra-elite competition, but I think that idea has a lot of explanatory power with what we see. I mean, for example, if you look at
sorry,
well, I was just going to say that, like, if you look at the sort of leaders of revolutions and social movements, they're not led by members of the underclass. Historically speaking, they've been members of like second tier elites or like educated people. So if you look at for example, Mao Zedong, if you look at Vladimir Lenin, if you look at even Hitler, you look at, I don't know, Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, the founding fathers of the US, right? Like the founding fathers of the US, the framers, or whatever you want to call them, they led a revolution against the British monarchy. But then if you look at the backgrounds of George Washington and Ben Franklin and these guys, like these guys were aristocratic, well-to-do guys, right? And they led the revolution against the king. So the people who lead social movements and revolutions who want to topple society, these are not like the downtrodden, poor people who are just like trying to get some bread. Like, no, these are like envious, angry elites who think that they should be in charge, not the current elites.
So would you say a more accurate word, like instead of luxury beliefs, would be like second tier intellectual beliefs?
I think that's more of a mouthful. I don't know if that would have caught on quite as well.
The second tier elites beliefs.
The second tier elites, but I think that the current elites, like the established elites, also maybe they don't necessarily believe the luxury beliefs, but they will express them. Like whatever the CEO of Goldman Sachs. Yes, they'll pander. That's right.
Because the second tiers are the consumers, whatever. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, one of the there was this psychologist, Clay Routledge, great psychologist. He had a tweet that I think it went viral. It was something like, what we have now are companies pretending to care about social justice to sell products to people who pretend to hate capitalism. And I think that pretty much encapsulates what's happening here. The sort of financial and business elite are, cynically exploiting the sort of cultural elite in order to make money. They feed on each other.
Wow. Jansen, do you still have any last minute questions? We've been going on for like 2 hours now. It's been such a fascinating and satisfying conversation. So.
Yeah, I guess I just have one question, but not related to this at all. I'm just like really, I think your Twitter page is really cool, and there are a lot of cool articles that I think they're very hard to find for a normal person. Like, how do you find all these interesting articles and like any interesting books you've read that like really changed your life recently?
Yeah, well, okay, so like the article, well, oftentimes people send things to me now, so it's really weird. Like the way I started out on Twitter was just like posting things that I read, and then like it slowly started to grow unexpectedly. I didn't expect it to grow the way it did, and then people started following me, and then they will send me interesting things or email me or DM me. So starting last year, authors of books started sending me free books, just like review copies of upcoming books that haven't even been released yet, and they're like asking me like, oh, can you read this and tell me what you think or whatever, and I'm like, yeah, sure. So that's like one way I sort of obtain content or whatever. And then as far as like books that have sort of changed my life or whatever, like that's I guess like like personal like for personal growth or development or whatever. One book that has helped me has been The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield. It's basically just like a book about like how to like obtain the right mindset and discipline to get the work that you need to do done. Um, and like I'm sure both of you, as like aspirational elites, are quite busy with your lives, and a lot of people that I know are extremely busy and like are trying to like basically find the motivation and the time and everything. Like, how do you get stuff done? And so this book has been really helpful. The War of Art, a book that is, yeah, I guess it's like it's a little bit dense, but it can be read by typical, just a smart person who's curious. Uh, the book Blueprint by Nicholas Christakis, just sort of like I think the subtitle is Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society, sort of like goes into social psychology, how we ended up getting along with one another. Another book, Hierarchy in the Forest, by Christopher Baim. He's an anthropologist, yeah, and he basically just documents how like the sort of politics of hunter-gatherer societies and how they operate, how they navigate concerns about reputation, about status, about resource allocation. And I think it's really enlightening to read because, again, like I mentioned this before, that like even though we live in the modern world, we still have this sort of psychology and the same sort of Stone Age brains, let's say, of those sort of earlier societies. And so I think this helps just sort of understand ourselves and social groups more.
Rob, are you an optimist or pessimist?
Oh man.
Or are you optimistic or pessimistic about where we're headed?
I don't know. I think, I've been mostly persuaded by like, I think Steven Pinker had that book, Enlightenment Now.
No.
Hans Rosling. Hans Rosling has the book Factfulness. Are you not a fan?
No, I'm not a fan. I'm just saying because he's a very big optimist in many ways.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So to some degree, I think like I'm persuaded by some of that, like in terms of like the material growth and the development and comforts and everything.
Yes.
But I think that like that's not enough. Basically, like George Orwell has this famous quote about how like a lot of people believe that like once we have our creature comforts, then we'll be set, right? Like once you have a comfortable bed and you have food and you have the sort of your physical needs met, then we'll be set. But that's not the way people are. Like, that's not where we came from. That's not the only thing we desire. So I do get concerned sometimes about like how, like we've been talking about this for a lot of this conversation. You have sort of the most comfortable, privileged people who are like calling for revolution and like joking about guillotines and stuff. Like one thing I'm concerned about is that like we will become so comfortable that we don't know like what humans are capable of. We've become so disconnected from our roots, what human societies have looked like up until 10 minutes ago, metaphorically speaking. Thomas Sowell, the great economist, from the Hoover Institution, taught at Stanford too. He's draws a distinction between, so he calls it the constrained versus the unconstrained views of human nature. Pinker actually writes about this too. I think he gave it a better name, the tragic vision versus the utopian vision. And so the utopian vision is that this idea that like if you sort of arrange social structures in the right way and sort of like let people do what they want, then that will lead to a great society, right? Like if we could just tweak the dials just right, that will lead to this kind of great flourishing, and we will sort of reach this utopia. And the tragic vision is this idea that like humans are inherently flawed and selfish and petty, and we should do our best to set up social institutions to sort of minimize the uglier aspects of our nature and to channel the more positive aspects of it. I think that like, one thing, for example, one example of this, I think, would be something like freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is, it's not Lindy, to use Nassim Taleb's word about like, it's not something that's existed historically. It is a very new idea that you should be able to speak your mind in a society. Historically, saying what you wanted could get you killed. Like that was the norm historically. Um, and so the current debates about it, I think that this is potentially dangerous because if you want to sort of like maintain and uphold a norm that cuts against the grain of human nature, which I think free speech does, you have to work really hard to convince people, yes, free speech is important. We know that it's uncomfortable. We know that you don't like it. We know that blah blah blah. Like like there are so many potential downsides of free speech, but the downside of getting rid of it is far worse. And so, if there are things that cut against it, we have to work even harder to maintain it. Um, something else, for example, would be uh, sexual relationships. The evolutionary psychologist Steve Stewart Williams has written in his book um, about whether humans are naturally monogamous or polygynous, whether we're meant to be with one person, what is our sort of like our natural way of being in social relationships, in romantic relationships. Um, and basically his conclusion is that we're both, we're capable of both. There is no like optimal way to have a relationship. There's no natural way. If you look at hunter-gatherer societies, they do tend towards more monogamy, but there is of course cheating and infidelity, and some of them do have different kinds of relationship arrangements. But if you want to have a society that that is best for children, the research does show that like living with both of their parents in two-parent family is the best for children. And so if you want to uphold that norm for the benefit of children, then yeah, we should do our best to sort of uphold, maintain, and preserve that sort of institution of having kids raised by two parents, even if we don't want to.
So much information to unpack, Rob. But I don't want to take more of your time. We've going on for a long time. This fascinating discussion. So I guess a concluding question would be, since the name of our show is Policy Punchline, what would be your punchline, I guess, for this conversation?
Yeah, I guess like my punchline would be, just reflect more about how you arrived at the beliefs you currently have. Did you reason your way into those? Did you come to those on your own, or were you influenced in ways that you haven't thought much about?
Well, I have to ask another follow-up then. I'm sorry. I that was supposed to be the concluding question, but let me ask. So one of my best friends and I, he's a very talented guy who does a lot of interviews with me, and he and I got in a debate about how we arrive at beliefs. And what I'm inherently kind of skeptical of how kids at our age arrive at beliefs, because we're like, 20? We don't know anything. We haven't really finished our undergrad degree, and we think that this policy has this effect. We think that this person is bad and good. It seems that we're completely incapable of making those judgments. So I ask him, how do you arrive at his belief? He says you have to take an ideological stance on certain things. So if you think there are merits to both Democratic tax policies and Republicans' tax policies, then you should take an ideological stance. Are you someone of the left, or are you someone of the conservative side? So, but that seems to be a tautology for me, which is that you believe in something because you value the merit of an argument, but you only value the merit of an argument because you believe in something. That is a tautology of actually knowing anything. So I don't know how to arrive at beliefs then, because if I don't trust because if I can't do the research myself, if I can't do the data survey myself, then I am simply forming my beliefs based on a set of facts that are floating on the internet that I don't know who fed it to me, right? This survey says 2/3 of America believes in Black Lives Matter. This survey says 80% of conservatives are, I don't know, So I just don't know anymore.
Yeah.
I think, oh, sorry, Rob.
No, please go ahead.
But yeah, back to Nassim. I think I read in his book, he's a big fan of Karl Popper. And I think Karl Popper's ideas would probably help you. Like he thinks that like the asymmetry of falsification, right? So basically you can have everything prove a theory right, but it can't never fully prove it. Like one disproof is enough to topple it, So you just have to keep like an open mind, probably. And just like be open to things to like falsify ideas.
Yeah, of course, like that's a really tough question. I would say for me, I mean, the way that I tend to think about it, although of course, like I also have my doubts, is to basically like identify what your actual values are. I think that like often we don't, we talk a lot about facts and truth and what's true, what's not true, but I think a lot of what's actually driving the debates might be a difference in values. And I think we're prone to assuming that everyone shares the same values we do because it's hard to believe that our values are wrong or that someone would disagree with them. So once you identify your values, then you can sort of like determine, well, what's the best way to achieve those ends. This is a tough conversation too about like, well, how do you shape your values? Where do those come from, and so on. And often that comes from culture, from society. No one sort of pops into the world with their own values. So yeah, just something to think about.
Rob, that was a wonderful concluding argument, and thank you so much for joining us again. It's just fascinating conversation. Would love to have you back on the show anytime when you inevitably have your next big finding and breakthrough in your research and new thoughts. I would love to have you back on the show if you have time. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tiger. Thanks, Jensen.
Yeah, thanks, Rob.
And Rob, one last thing. How can people learn more about your work, follow you, subscribe to your newsletter?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a website yet. I'm working on it now, but you can just follow me at Rob K. Henderson. Yeah, I'll have the website up. I'm working on a memoir. Yeah, later on, just hopefully I'll be able to promote that soon and maybe join you guys again.
That sounds great. Well, that was our conversation with Rob Henderson. My friend Jensen and I hosted the show. We hope you enjoyed the full conversation. It's almost 2 hours long. You can watch the full conversation on our YouTube channel or on policypunchline.com. Follow us on iTunes, Spotify. Definitely follow Rob on Rob K. Henderson, at Rob K. Henderson on Twitter. And you may subscribe to his newsletters, which is a fascinating short read every once in a while and keeps you informed about human nature, about all kinds of ideas. So thank you so much for listening today. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Policy Punchline, a podcast generously supported by the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance at Princeton University. We would also like to encourage you to follow other podcasts produced by Princeton University, such as Politics and Polls by the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs. Policy Punchline is intended to be informational only and does not reflect nor represent the views of Princeton University or the Julius Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance. For more information on subscription, donation, volunteering, or contact, please visit policypunchline.com. Thank you again for listening.